Once we've completed the project planning process using the PERT method, we can use the PERT results to determine how costs can be planned and scheduled over the life of the project. We need to identify all of the costs associated with each activity. Then we need to lay out a plan for how the budgeted costs for an activity will be spent as that activity is undertaken. To do that, I use a layout like this. I have the activity, the earliest start time, the latest start time, the duration of the activity, and the total cost for each activity. Earliest start time, latest start time, and duration are taken from the PERT analysis. To create the periodic cost for each activity, I simply take the total cost for the activity and divide it by or spread it over the duration for activity. So if the activity takes 2 weeks, I'm going to take the 22,000 here, divide that by 2, and I get 11,000 per week. And I'll just copy that down and get the period costs for each activity. This sheet is the earliest start time costs. We'll do earliest start time, then we'll do latest start time. So we'll have 2 scenarios, costing for 2 scenarios completed. The key to doing this quickly, especially over a large project, is to first of all determine how many periods the project will last. We determined the length of the project using the PERT analysis, and that was simply the latest start time of our last node plus the duration of that node gives us 15 weeks in this case. So we have 15 weeks here. Now we need to determine what activities are taking place during each of these weeks and the cost associated with those activities for that week. To do that, we're going to write an if statement. Start with if. The first thing we want to do is satisfy 2 logical conditions. We want to see if the period we're in is at the lower limit, the start time for an activity, and if the period we're in is under the higher limit or the end time of an activity. So we'll use the AND function to test for 2 conditions. The first thing we'll do is we'll take our current period and we'll need to set that so that the row is absolute. We want to copy this along, and as we move across, we want to move from period to period, but as we move down, we want to stay locked on row 3. We want to see if this is greater than the earliest start time for activity, and we're going to need to lock the column for that activity. We want it to move down as we move down, but as we move across, we want to stay in the earliest start time column. And again, we want to check our activity. We'll need to lock the row on that to see if it's less than or equal to the earliest start time. Since this is the earliest start time section, we'll need to be sure to lock the column there, plus the duration. Again, lock the column there. That will be the end time. So if our period is between the start time and the end time for activity, that means it's the activity that's taking place during this period. So if that's the case, we will apply costs. We'll need to lock the column on that. Otherwise, we'll just leave it a blank, 2 double quotes next to each other. Press enter. Then I'll copy this down and across. The if statement spreads the costs out over the period in which the activities are taking place. This allows me to calculate a per day budget, or a per week, I guess this is. I do that using the sum function. I'll just take a sum of the column above me, leave those relative. Copy those across. Now I can keep a running total, and I'll do that using the sum function. The sum, and I'm going to start with column G12, but I'm going to set that to be absolute by typing $G, $12, colon, and then just put G12 in relative. That way the sum range will grow as I copy it across the periods. You can see it's anchored at the start point, cell G12, but as I stretch it across, the relative portion of the range changes relative to the new current position of the sum function, and it just continuously extends the range all the way across, creating a running total. So we calculated the period costs by dividing the total costs by the number of periods. We determined in what periods these costs would be applied by using the if statement and the and statement to test to see if our period was between the start time and the finish time for the activity, and if it was, applying activity costs to that period. We created a budget per week, an amount of money we need each week, and then we created a cumulative total so that we could see how total costs were moving across the periods. Now we'll do the same thing here, using for the latest start time, starting in activity A. Just do the same process. We have 15 weeks. We already have our period costs. We already have the information up above, so I'll just use that. I'll use my if statement again and the and statement. First logical test is to see if the period I'm in, and I'll lock the row, is greater than the latest start time, since this is the latest start time, and I'll have to lock the column on this. And again, see if the period I'm in, lock the row, is less than or equal to the latest start time, and I'll lock the column on that, plus the duration of the activity. Again, lock the column on that. If it is, then I will apply cost for that period, lock the column, otherwise a blank, 2 double quotes. Copy this down. Now you may think that you made a mistake because nothing happens here, simply because there are no costs to be applied to that period, so don't panic. Just copy it across, and it's at this point that you'll see whether or not you've made a mistake. Now I'll go ahead and calculate my budget per, again, week. I'll make that correction. And we're going to take the sum then of all the activities for that period. Copy that across. Then we'll start a cumulative total. And that first value is found in cell G26. So I'll do $G, $26, colon, G26. Absolute and relative cell references. That gives me cumulative budget total for period 1. And then as I copy it across, I get the cumulative budget total for all of the other periods